Globalism is really
multinationals.
communism, in my opinion.
They say that's anti-Semitic to call it globalism now. And it's like, what? It just means people who are in favor of a one world system of governance.
Yeah.
Well, who is he even complaining about? It is not, what? What is it? Can he, how did we get to this topic? How did we? Now, I posted this video of like Michael Jackson lowering a gun, and I posted a meme with it that said, or just like a message along the lines of what Trump supporters think Trump will do on day one. And I was a little bit joking, but it was in response to Donald Trump during the town hall saying, if I am elected president, I will end the war in Ukraine on day one. Now, Trump makes a lot of promises like this. He made promises about the wall and Mexico paying for it. He made promises about getting rid of all of America's national debt in 4 years. Well, then he increased it by 7.5 trillion while in office. He makes a lot of bold promises that he cannot back up constantly. But this was one that I saw some people in the magosphere kind of believing or actually buying, that Trump could just go in and like lower everyone's guns. And if he just went in there and said, Zelensky, you have to give up 5 oblasts to the Russians and they will accept peace. Zelensky will say no. And then somehow Trump's going to get around that. Or he'll abandon Ukraine. Those are like the two scenarios, that somehow Trump isn't lying and he actually is the best negotiator in the world, or he's going to abandon Ukraine and he's going to basically wipe his hands of it on day one and say, look, I tried. I said, hey, Ukraine, give up all of your people to be mass graved. And they said no. And, you know, we're at an impasse. They don't want to be mass graved. The Russians want to mass grave them. You know, it's an impasse. Anyway, I didn't believe many Trump supporters actually bought this, that even most people who were voting for him, the majority of them would see this and say, it's just Trump being Trump. He's being braggadocious as always. We've all come to expect it of the man. But apparently not for everyone. Tim Pool says Trump will end the war in Ukraine in 10 minutes by using the genius strategy of asking everyone to stop fighting. Let's listen to him. Also, he's talking to Carrie Lake in this clip, by the way. Very funny.
Was wrong when he said he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. He's completely wrong. He'd end it in 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes, how would that be?
He'd get on the phone. As the moment Trump becomes president, he's on the phone with Putin. He's on the phone with Zelensky, and he says, stop fighting. We're going to talk. The fighting stops. The war's over. Now, of course.
What am I supposed? There's so many question marks in there. There's so many. They're so simplistic. He said it was like so matter of fact. Like everyone's like, oh, I didn't even think about that. Like he does a Zoom call instead of calling them one-on-one. It's a Zoom call, and the pressure of the Zoom call would make all the fighting stop. Of course, because Putin respects Trump so much, and Zelensky is his subservient dog as a Western proxy. That's the only outcome, is he just asks, and all the fighting stops, and all the soldiers out in the field, including Wagner, which has a terrible discipline problem, and all of the Ukrainian territorial defense, they're all just going to be like, oh, we have to stop fighting? We have to let possibly some Russians occupy more Ukrainian territory? Oh yeah, oh, Trump said so. Okay, well, we respect him immensely here. Yeah, I mean, Trump has a lot of respect here. When I go out and I was talking to all the Ukrainian soldiers, they said they served Trump first, Ukraine second, Zelensky third. That was the exact order. It was told to me almost like it was their Bible.
Yes.
He gives no explanation. My only response to that is how? How? He gave as much detail as Trump gives when he talks about how he's going to bring peace to Ukraine. How? How does that work?
In a literal sense of conflict, the moment Trump's elected, the fighting stops. And from that point forward, the fighting will never resume. That is the war being over. Formally
Dude, Carrie Lake, the person who will never accept the fact that she lost, that is just an extension of Trump on all of his ego. Carrie Lake is gobsmacked. She's gobsmacked. She's in shock at what Tim Pool is saying. Lonerbox, thank you for the rate of 151 people. Jade Monkey, thank you for the tier 1 sub. Dylan, what part of you just call them up and tell them to stop do you not understand? The logic is bulletproof. Okay, so a lot of this kind of goes off the idea of like very interpersonal politics. It's just like very like personally, if Trump called these people and was personal about it, he's a good negotiator and he can get it done. But I understand how this perspective can be formed because Trump, in his diplomacy and his negotiation, heavily invests in that personal element. But a lot of times that personal element doesn't matter. For example, when Donald Trump was getting rolled by Xi Jinping, where every single time the American government would send any type of former representative over to Taiwan, Xi Jinping would call Trump and tell him to stop. And Trump, favoring that personal touch to politics, would run to his staff, yell at them like, I don't want to hear about Taiwan. I don't want to hear about Hong Kong. And they would keep pulling back all these American diplomats till they were sending lower and lower and lower ranking diplomats over to Taiwanese. He was getting rolled on the personal level. So I don't even think Trump is that good on the personal level, but that is something that he talks about a lot in his book, Art of the Deal. That's part of his mentality and how he is a deal maker. But let's assume that personally, Zelensky and Trump get along enough that this could work, and that Zelensky couldn't just be like, look, I'm going to ask the American Congress to support me, which, by the way, I know this is hard to believe, but the American Congress do hold authority when it comes to foreign policy. And there's already been talk about how Congress could support Ukraine without the support of the executive branch. And there are ways for them to do it. He couldn't just go to the Germans, who just approved $2.7 billion in aid. He couldn't go to his other backers. Obviously, losing the support of the President of the United States would be a negative for him. But to assume that Zelensky has no leverage or hasn't shown that the Ukrainians do have the ability to fight, when those victories in that early days of the war, first month, second month, was 95% to 98, 99% Ukrainian, where they were using their own stockpiles. They were using their own soldiers trained by their own people to push the Russians back, their own willpower to push the Russians back from Kiev. That still exists. That mentality, that passion to fight, that still exists in Ukraine, probably now more than ever. So I don't even think he could necessarily do it on an interpersonal level. But let's get past that barrier for a second and say that maybe he could convince Zelensky and Putin to just stop fighting and try to and like sign a deal. Whatever that deal would be, in my mind, I think it'd be a lot more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian. But then it also assumes that Zelensky has complete control of his country, which is not the case. Zelensky is a figurehead. Zelensky is somebody who's helped people rally around the flag, but Zelensky's popularity, and this is something that a lot of people outside of Ukraine don't realize, rests almost entirely upon his ability to resist the Russians. Once he stops being a good tool, a good politician to resist the Russians, and he's now the person who caves to them, his popularity in politics is over. His time in politics is over. If he will not be elected out next election, he might be removed out under the current government, as in they physically remove him. Some people say, oh, will the militias do it? No, it wouldn't even have to be the militias. It would be the Ukrainian people themselves on the streets. The idea that they would just so quickly sign away all this territory and land to the Russians based upon Donald Trump's whims and because Zelensky said so is silly. And that's where the personal politics fails, is because if it is so against the basic interests of a state to negotiate that away, and the basic interests of that people to negotiate their land away, then they're not going to do it. And so that's why I laugh at the idea of Donald Trump doing this in 24 hours or within 10 minutes, unless we see some guidebook and some plan that could convince the Ukrainians and the Russians. As of right now, there is no middle ground to be found. Their positions are irreconcilable. And saying that is just acknowledging the reality of the situation.
Declaring an end to hostilities will take 24 hours. Okay, fair point. But I think the issue here is, do you want Ukraine to win the war? What does that mean, winning the war? How do you ever really win a war?
I don't know. Victory. You achieve all of your goals is usually how you would win. A lot of countries define their own thing of define victory themselves. But for example, in World War II, our victory was determined by the capitulation of the German Axis, the Italian fascists, and the Japanese. And their capitulation and their occupation marked us winning the war because we got revenge for Pearl Harbor, we got a demilitarized Japan, a demilitarized Germany, a demilitarized Italy, and we had defeated fascism. And we had defeated the countries which had aggressed upon Europe and much of Asia. That was victory. So victory here, as the Ukrainians have defined on multiple occasions, would be getting the Russians out of Ukraine, which is what the international community has deemed illegal, what the international community has keep voting to condemn, and we are completely within our rights under international law to support, because sending weapons and sending aid to a country under invasion, including military aid, is 100% legal under international law.
Everybody dies and then the fighting stops.
Makes you
Is that the scenario? If the war continues another year, everyone in Ukraine will die. Everyone in Ukraine will die. Look, I don't want to underplay the severity of the war here. A lot of people are dying, but the options aren't Ukraine has to cave to the Russians or everyone dies. That's not the only two scenarios. That also assumes that if the fighting, quote unquote, stops on the contact line right now, that the Russians won't kill anybody, which is silly and ridiculous. Not to mention, this conflict also has a history of failed ceasefires. Iko Rich, thank you so much for the tier 1 being sub for 14 months on a 3-month streak. What did you say? You put down a message. We will win when Russia no longer has a land bridge to Crimea. Well, the thing is, the Ukrainians could like mark victory in two ways. It could be the return of the 2022 borders, because then that would mean this operation the Russians tried to engage in, the SMO, the special military operation, failed. Or it could be an end to the war in its entirety, as in pushing the Russians out of all of Ukraine.
wonder if there's, well, there's this globalist push, and this war really, really would accelerate that push, unfortunately. And
what does that even mean? There's a globalist push. A push for what? Economic dominance, cultural manipulation, more gays in cartoons. Just know there's a globalist push, and this war accelerates that push. No detail.
So if we get Trump in charge,
and he disagrees with it with no detail. Yep, yeah, that's true, Carrie.
We stop that that march toward a globalist kind of future, what do they call it? They're trying to change the word.
Wait. Is her belief that Putin is a warrior against globalism, and that the Russian invasion, if we negotiate a ceasefire, it is another blow against the globalists? Or is she just saying that the perpetuation of war, no matter the war in and of itself, is a success for globalists? Because if that's the case, would that mean if America was invaded by China, we would have to negotiate immediately, maybe sign away California, sign away Colorado, West Virginia, who knows what states, for peace, and that would be a victory against globalism? What would this, again, there's none of the terms, none of the specifics were defined here, so you just kind of have to guess.
Globalism is really communism, in my opinion.
They say that's anti-Semitic to call it globalism now. And it's like, what? It just means people who are in favor of a one world system of governance.
Yeah.
Well, who is he even complaining about? It is not, what? What is it? How did we get to this topic? Does he talk like this with his guests? Oh, did you know they're calling globalism anti-Semitism now? It's anti-Semitism and call it globalism? What is he even talking about?
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with your race.
I think he ends it in 24 hours as well. And I think you're probably right. Before he even takes the oath of office.
Hostilities cease. I bet the moment he gets
49 state landslide. 49 state landslide. If Tim Pool really believes this, I want to see him commit to it. That if Trump is elected president and he doesn't negotiate peace within 24 hours in Ukraine, I want to see Tim Pool come out publicly saying, I was wrong. I know nothing about international diplomacy. I know nothing about geopolitics. I'm a clown. I'll never talk about foreign policy again. I want to see that commitment from Tim Pool. That's what I want to see.
As soon as the results come in on TV. So in fact, Trump was wrong. It's going to be -2 months. The results come in saying Trump is president.
Well, if it's this easy to bring end to conflicts, why is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict not been negotiated yet? I mean, if Trump's such a great negotiator, he was in office for 4 years while the war in the Donbass was still going on. It was still a thing. It wasn't an extremely hot war, but it was still there. He could have negotiated it at any point during his presidency. He fails to do it. But now he gets back into office, and in day one, he does it. Just like, the abolishing all of our debt. All of our debt will be gone, even though he raised our debt by $7.5 trillion. Just like the wall being paid for by Mexico never happened. Just like many of the promises he made and never came true. Why didn't he negotiate the end to the Palestine-Israel conflict? Why did he never negotiate that? Why is he unable to negotiate all these other conflicts? But he's going to be able to negotiate this one in 24 hours, even though their positions are completely irreconcilable. Get out of here.
Putin immediately says, get me in touch with Trump's people. I bet Putin says it because he knows that he's going to get a little bit. Ukraine knows the fighting stops, and they're going to say, okay.
This is like an embarrassing level of naivete on behalf of Tim Pool on how this would go. Number one, he doesn't know what the status of the war on the ground is. What if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is effective? They push back to close to 2014 borders, but they're on the gates of Mariupol and they want to capture it back. And for many Ukrainians, no, for all Ukrainians, negotiation of the Russians keeping Mariupol is absolutely ridiculous. Is he going to be able to stop the Ukrainians from launching that counteroffensive day one? What if they're occupying half of Crimea and they've already destroyed the Kerch Bridge and they could take the rest of it? What if it's in any other way and the Russians are in a more advantageous position where now negotiation isn't in their favor anymore? Who knows what the status of the war is going to be on the day he negotiates? Tim Pool is basing this analysis on information he doesn't even have. That's what makes this so silly. It's already silly based upon the conditions that currently exist. Assuming that Trump was to become president tomorrow, this would not happen. Definitely since the Ukrainians have the ability to launch more counteroffensive and liberate more territory. But this analysis that he is doing is also based upon information we don't currently have. This is very shallow foreign policy analysis, not necessarily saying I expected much more from Tim Pool, but man, how easy is it to get on the Tim Pool podcast? Is it easy? Is it hard? I know that Lance got on, but if this is his genuine position, I would be more than happy to talk to Tim Pool about it. My goodness. My goodness. I needed a reason to go back to the States in July. This would give me a good reason. Anyway, what a silly take.